So, regarding blasphemy laws, the discrimination and abuses in them is of great concern. The broad definitions of what constitutes blasphemy, the clearly dubious and elastic grounds for charges of blasphemy, the cruel implementation of penalties, these are very problematic matters in Muslim-majority countries currently. From my research, it seems clear that Muslim blasphemy laws, and especially their applications, impact non-Muslims, ex-Muslims, reformist Muslims, minority groups, religious and political dissenters. They infringe the fundamental human freedoms of belief and expression. They are also used by people to incite violence against members of the groups mentioned, thereby feeding into religious persecution. Blasphemy laws are discriminatory, as are apostasy laws, which deny freedom of belief. So basically, blasphemy laws are incompatible with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but they are, as I demonstrate in my paper, also incompatible with the cardinal Islamic divine names. And that is why the title is The Blasphemy and Blasphemy Laws. My paper provides, as I showed you, a sample survey of the blasphemy laws and reports of high-profile cases in Pakistan, Iran, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Saudi Arabia. So people like Asya Bibi in Pakistan, who has been languishing for 10 years in jail on a bizarre little charge, which all started because she drank water out of the same cup that the Muslim peasant folk in her village also drank from. And then while she was being beaten, she stated, well, my Jesus saved me, what did your Muhammad do for you? And that was blasphemy. She's charged in 10 years on the brink of insanity now. And her family, of course, have had to flee from village to village for their own safety. In Iran, we have Muhammad Ali Tahiri, 5 years in prison, solitary confinement for most of it. He was hospitalized in a coma, and whereabouts were unknown. What was his charge? He happens to have a kind of Gnostic system which he is teaching to others, and that involves both a kind of concept but also an alternative method of practice, kind of a homeopathic practice. So, for example, you know that homeopaths and acupuncturists, before they've asked your name, they will have their fingers on your pulse. So he's been charged with immoral touching of women, with offending Islamic sanctities. When he was due to be released, he was charged with another crime, which predated all this, and he's still in prison. His followers who are demonstrating are also being arrested. In Malaysia, the ex-governor of Jakarta, Busaki Purnama, during the elections, he advised his people, or mentioned, that they should not be fooled by those people who are trying to trick the Muslim population using a particular verse of the Qur'an into not voting for him because he's Christian. So he's standing trial for blasphemy, having said that. Of course, in Saudi Arabia, we have Raif Badawi, but anyone who's calling for reform, anyone who speaks out against the status quo is charged with blasphemy or terrorism and is in prison. So people like ourselves would be being lashed in prison if we were in Saudi Arabia. So the questions of apostasy and freedom of belief and free will are also taken up in my paper, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is compared to the Cairo Declaration. Focusing on religious persecution for a moment, in addition to violating human rights, it also violates elements of the Muslim faith while being based in the minds of the perpetrators on a particular interpretation of aspects of their religion. Now, it goes without saying that there are non-Muslim extremists and there are non-Muslim governments that violate fundamental freedoms and human rights. Compiling any such list would be a thorough globe-trotting exercise, more as a tragedy. However, I am in this paper concerned to address and help counter such things within my own religious heritage. And my paper is therefore focused on Muslim perpetration. And it seeks to provide a response from within our tradition. So I demonstrate how the values of universal human rights and freedoms are profoundly compatible with the most sacred principles of Islam, while blasphemy laws are not. I also propose a new principial rather than chronological format for naskh, which is scriptural and legal abrogation. In support of my propositions, I provide Quranic verses and precedents from the Islamic theological and legal heritage. All of this is done based on an objective understanding of the values designated by the cardinal Islamic divine names, which you now have up on the screen. These cardinal divine names designate the most sacred principles in Islam. And as you can see, they're pretty impersonal, and perhaps particularly important for us are names like Al-Abu, the justice, impartiality, justice, and Al-Muqsit, the one who is just and equitable. Al-Wasil, the all-encompassing, inclusive, pluralistic. And Al-Muhit, also the all-embracing, the tolerant, etc. Now, there is a key epistemological question that Muslims need to address on this matter. How do we Muslims understand the values which are enshrined in God's names? Do we define the understanding based on what the religion says, so internally, subjectively, based on a particular socio-cultural take and context? Or do we understand them objectively as transcendent, overarching principles? That is the key epistemological question that we need to think about. The proposition I put forward for consideration is that the objective values enshrined in the cardinal divine names are the just cogents, the incontravenable principles in the interpretation and application of the Qur'an, the Sharia, fiqh, and Islamic laws. And here are a couple of key Quranic verses, which I won't go through in detail, that support the proposition that I'm making. I will just say that in 3030, there is an affirmation of the divine nature as the eternal religion or law, not the Sharia, nor any other revealed religious law, but God's nature. So this is directly relevant to the matter of abrogation. If the proposed principle, well, that's a bit on abrogation. If the proposed principle is implemented, then those materials within Muslim jurisprudence and its sources that promote peace, impartial justice and equality, pluralism and religious tolerance will be preferenced in application as they are consistent with the correlative divine names. Whereas those materials within Muslim jurisprudence and its sources which are less compatible or incompatible with these principles would be deemed inapplicable. For instance, the materials promoting the isolation, maltreatment, and killing of non-Muslims, apostates, or dissenters, or different minorities, as well as the materials promoting discrimination or inequalities on the basis of gender. Having established the cardinal divine names as the just cogents in Muslim interpretation, my paper goes on to demonstrate how the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is fully aligned with the objective values of the transcendent divine names. And again, I provide Quranic support for this. So the humane, equitable, and all-encompassing values enshrined in universal human rights and fundamental freedoms are expressions of the higher aspects of human nature, whose prototype is the divine nature itself. So what I go on to show is that the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights subjects the Sharia, subjects the Universal Declaration to the Sharia, and that's going about it the wrong way around, because that is to subject the greater, overarching, to the narrower, smaller, culture-specific interpretation. Whereas the UDHR, the Universal Declaration, is actually aligned with the overarching, all-embracing principles.